Yesterday's incident in Prague has launched a heated debate in Canadian hockey circles. Did the Canadian team and its coaches behave as they should? We are joined by former NHL coach Don Cherry and by longtime sports writer Michael Farber. Michael Farber, everybody in the country seems upset with somebody on this question. Who are you upset with?
I'm upset with Bert Templeton, the coach of the Canadian junior team. If Bert Templeton had really wanted to avoid what had happened in Czechoslovakia, he would have told his players, under no circumstances should you fight. If the Russians go over the board, which apparently they did do, you skate to this bench and stay away from them. Don't allow yourself to be suckered. Bert Templeton apparently is taking the blame, and I think this is where the blame lies.
Don Cherry, who do you blame?
Well, I don't. I blame the Russians. Naturally, anybody with any mind would blame the Russians. It definitely wasn't Bert Templeton's fault at all, because what are you supposed to do? See 20 Russians going to go at 5 Canadians. I'd like to ask Michael, right here and now, if his son was one of the 5 and he was being beaten up by the Russians, would he say, stay on the bench, let my son be beat up? I think not.
First of all, I want to lay to rest the canard that there were 20 Russians. According to stories that I've seen, 4 Russians had gone over the boards before the first Canadian, so it was not a 20-5 disadvantage. Also, if I were a player and I were interested in that gold medal, I'd get my body over to the bench and allow the Russians to take all the penalties and be disqualified.
Don Cherry, if the Soviets were crowding Canada because Canada was going to get a gold medal and they weren't, I mean, isn't that the kind of ball you have to be prepared for?
It was the Russians' fault all the way. He sent the 2 players on there. He opened the gate. You get out there. And it's not our Canadian way to see our guys laying on the ice with more Russians out there and anything. And I think any person watching out there, if your son was laying on the ice or there was more Russians beating them out, you'd go out there and help them, and that's exactly what we did. I'm not saying it's right what they did.
Okay, let Michael Farber respond to you.
Okay, Michael.
Certainly it's not Bert Templeton's fault in that he threw a punch, but there are more ways to do this than what you call the Canadian way, the macho, disciplined, stick up for your mates kind of way. You need a certain maturity in international hockey. It's not played the way the Canadian game is, where fighting is built in. There are penalties for fighting. Written right into the rule book. There's a penalty for fighting in international hockey. It's banishment. The players had to go over to Czechoslovakia.
Wait a minute, Michael. Wait a minute. 2 years ago, the Russians and United States had a battle. They say it would make this one look like a tea party. Naturally, the Russians are going for a gold medal, so they didn't throw it out. There was just about a few penalties, and away we go. And I guarantee you, if the roles had been reversed, if they were going for the gold and we were out of it and we had gone on, I'm sure those foreigners over there in that commission would have found some way for them to win the gold medal.
Okay, Michael Farber, I've heard that point made all day. Why don't you deal with it?
Well, Don, it's really beside the point. You knew the possible ramifications of what could happen here. When you go over and you play by international rules, you have to adopt international standards. And one of them is avoiding fights at all costs. No questions, the Russians suckered the Canadian players. But Canada would have to find a way to respond, and that's what maturity is.
Do you think, Michael Farber, when you say that the Russians suckered the Canadians, that they just couldn't stand it, that Canada could get out of there with a gold?
I really can't guess at what motivated the Russians. Certainly, they've adopted a more physical style of play in recent years. But once it happened, the Canadian players had to show more maturity than the Russians. They had to avoid the situation. I'll give you an example of what happened earlier this year at the Montreal Forum. John Kordic, who plays for the Canadians and was certainly no wimp or no sissy, suckered Jay Miller of the Boston Bruins into taking a 5-minute fighting penalty by refusing to fight. It gave the Canadians a 5-minute power play. As he skated off the ice to the Canadians bench, Kordic pointed to his head, showing how smart he had been. Everyone in the forum ate that up.
Yes, but Michael, that's true. But it's a little different situation where you have the Russians going on the ice, outnumbering our guys. And we already had one guy laying down on the ice, and you